the universal mass, but everywhere in your localities. And hello, Trackle House and Salzburg and Sophie Colts and Summer Academy. Marina Fokidis that have been working together with Sophie Colts on this program of the Summer Academy. And today is our 5th talk of the program Horizon of Possibilities. And we have the honor to have with us Dubravka Sekulic. Before I introduce you very briefly, I wanted to say that during the last almost 5 weeks, like less than 5 weeks, but let's say the last month, ideas on commoning, alternative scenarios, alternative desires, new ways or different ways of approaching the common or the commons have been discussed thoroughly. And in case you want to somehow revisit the previous talks, you can always do via the YouTube channel of the International Summer Academy. So Dubravka Sekulic, if I pronounce it well, is an architect and educator whose work focuses on the investigation of the transformation of the contemporary city and in its relationship to laws of property and economy. She is interested in understanding, as he says, the built environment as an archive and unsettling the common sense of architecture. She is a senior tutor at the School of Architecture in Royal College of Art and holds a PhD in architectural history and theory from the GTA Institute for History and Theory, Department of Architecture in Zurich. She regularly publishes and lectures across Europe. She's an author of several books and features, and most recently she completed a film, Don't Trace, Draw, with filmmaker Anna Hassman. Dubravka, hello, it's great to have you with us and listening on we are ready to listen on the paradigm and the reality of library. And here I pass the microphone to you, and I'm leaving the room for some time. So hello, Dubravka.
Hello, Marina, thank you so much. I'll just focus on sharing my screen before I start talking. Okay, I hope that now you just see my slide. Does it work?
Yes,
okay.
It's it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to thank Marina, Sophie, and everyone from Salzburg Summer Academy for inviting me to be part of this year's program. For years, I have been admiring the Academy from afar and the ways in which it, without a lot of pomp, reframes understanding of what is the relationship between art and the world and intervenes in the specific context of Austria, but also far beyond. And actually, when my talk was announced as part of the program, I got a message from a friend of mine who is who is living in the US, who wrote me, "Oh, it's amazing that you're going there. Being part of the Salzburg Academy a couple of years ago reframed the way I see the world and really changed my practice." So I really feel kind of enormously honored to have been invited to speak at the Academy. And I'm really sad that I could not come and be with you in person, but I'm also extremely grateful for the organizers that you had an understanding and accommodated my caution to travel for traveling in this period of time. So given that we are gathered here via Zoom from many places in the world, so at least from near Serbia, where I'm speaking from, or Athens, where Marina is zooming in, and Salzburg, there are two reminders that I would like to make before we start, which I think are really pertinent to this conversation, especially the ones when we talk about commons. I also, even before that, wants to make a remark. There is a really upset dog behind the door that I closed myself off as I'm visiting my parents. So if you hear some distress, he's okay. He's just extremely keen on having us all together in one space, but I hope he will behave. So going back to two points I want to make, which are somehow prompted by the fact that we are using Zoom. So first is connected to the issue of land and resources. While I'm talking to you from my hometown Niš, as Marina said, most of my professional affiliations are now connected to the places which are understood as centers. Most recently, I'm living and working in London. And I want to acknowledge that the power of the center that brought me to live and work in London, that was built on violence of colonialism and imperialism and enclosure and extraction, which uprooted many people from their ancestral lands and destroyed many other ways of being in the world. And as we have been discussing these days how to recover old and envision new ways of being in the world together, I would also like to invite you here all to reflect for a moment on questions of land and dispossession in places where you are tuning in from. Secondly, as this lecture takes place on Zoom, I also want to remind you that in September 2020, Zoom, with support of YouTube and Facebook, unilaterally canceled the San Francisco State University talk by Laila Khaled, a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, without warning, in an attempt to censor academic discussion. It disagreed with. Only a few weeks later, Zoom further canceled two talks that were scheduled, ironically, to discuss the censorship of political discussions on tech platforms. And one of these events were being organized by the New York University and were to include a professor and a MacArthur Genius Fellow, Fred Moten. And all these events were continuation of silencing of the voices of Palestinian struggle and freedom. Zoom as a platform sits at the nexus of military-industrial complex in which culture and academia also are part of. And if these events of cancellation were not enough for us to understand that we cannot take for granted Zoom as a platform, the event that few months later, a former Arizona governor and the US Secretary of Homeland Security and the president of the University of California, Janet Napolitano, was appointed to the board of Zoom, an appointment that was framed as a quote, bringing education and public policy expertise to a video communications leader, probably say more than they wanted to say. And while I'm grateful that we can convene in this virtual space of study across time zones and territories, it is important to be reminded that we are discussing struggle using the infrastructure provided by the ruling class that does not come without environmental, human, or spatial costs. Yet, before it gets turned off, we must insist on using it against the grain of its origin as a tool of optimization of the labor exploitation and surveillance, and use it as a tool of organizing and solidarity. And while there are some alternatives which mitigate some of the problems congealed in Zoom, some other platforms, a lot of these platforms are still connected to the extractivist paradigm in which, unfortunately, most of the internet is deeply steeped in. With this, I will now move to my talk, which I think you'll see somehow relates to the issues that I have been starting with. The title of my talk is, of course, internally indebted to Sylvia Wynter, and not just the talk, but a lot of thinking that helped me frame some of these aspects of the talk. Sylvia Wynter teaches us that one of the most important things we have to do is to rethink and think new type of epistemes in which we think the contemporary world, and to think this in relation without writing texts that you can easily extract snippets that you can quote. So her work is something that I've been indebted because it's really, in the way it's written, really asks one to engage with in a communal together in the form of group. And it is a type of commoning that and socialization of knowledge that it has been inspired, has been inspiring type of proposals I will be discussing with. So in a way, I invite you also to think almost of every my slide as something in which it would be footnoted with enormous gratitude to Sylvia Winter in a line of practice that I learned from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, which footnotes every page of some of her work to specific authors with whom she is constantly thinking about while writing certain pages. So the second part of my talk is a play on the concept of really useful knowledge, a principle devised in the workers' awareness of the need for self-education in the UK, in opposition on the being and in opposition on the beginning of the conversation about the importance of national education, that would give the working class useful knowledge, defined in which usefulness was defined by the capitalist church in the ruling elite, meaning applicable skills. This is, of course, the conversation that started in the 18th and 19th century. So really useful knowledge understood education as a political strategy or as a means of changing the world, as this was articulated by Richard Johnson in his paper, Really Useful Knowledge, Radical Education in Working Class Culture. And really useful knowledge challenged the idea of practical by celebrating quote unquote unpractical knowledges such as politics, economics, philosophy, and above all arts. This was by no means unique to the context of the UK, and throughout the world, the resistance to the capitalist exploitation of both wage labor and enslaved was not only through refusal of labor and refusal of work, but also of the refusal of the total control of capitalist approach to organization of time. Rancière writes about this in about the proletarian nights, which almost come as a paradox, that exploited workers don't spend the night resting, but actually spend the nights producing culture, seizing the maze to interpret their own world in order to better understand their own position. So really useful knowledge was and is about taking control over who interprets and defines what collective life is and what it can be. Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael reminds us that those control definitions are on power. Really useful knowledge tries to destabilize this asymmetry of power. I owe to the curatorial collective VHV, Who, What, Who, How, and For Whom, a world for introducing me to this concept of really useful knowledge. And in their text with the same name, in the catalog of the exhibition entitled Really Useful Knowledge, they curated in 2014 in the Museum Reina Sofia in Madrid, they write, really useful knowledge demands a change by unveiling the causes of exploitation and tracing its origin within the ruling ideology. It is a collective, emancipatory, theoretical, emotional, informative, and practical quest that starts with acknowledging what we don't know, but what we do not yet know. And this, when I read this quote, this concept, when I read this, then this concept was not only just influential in my thinking, but it also kind of really made me think how this is also something that I think of library in many ways, that I have this kind of strong belief in libraries as one spaces that can fulfill some of these elements that they use to connect with the concept of really useful knowledge. This concept, of course, was not just that I connected it to the concept of the library, but it was also influential on Chartists and Owenites in the UK, and it would influence the groups that influenced the formation of public library as institution in the UK. And this my talk I will be focusing on the library both as a symptom and as a kind of analysis as a physical space, but also as a kind of a concept around which we can think issues of access, accessibility, and who is the knowledge for, and who prevents and who organizes how we access it in space and time. So racially useful knowledge is also important because it emerges as a concept in opposition and in struggle over the control of resources, and not of resources on one side, but also on definitions and interpretations. And both are always at stake. So when we think about library, so let's start by looking at the dictionary definition of a library in English. And this is the one I pulled out just for my dictionary applications on Mac. So this one defines library as a building or room containing collections of books, periodicals, and sometimes films and recorded music for use or borrowing by the public or the members of an institution. And then there are several other kind of examples in which library is explained. And I'm pulling this out also because dictionaries are, again, one of these spaces in which we kind of rely on to help us navigate our life and the world, especially in this world in which many of us live most of our personal and professional life in a language that is not necessarily the one that we were we grew up with. And I have always been amazed in ways in which the subtle ideological framing of words is always present by the various ways in which example sentences are, the ways in which those who write dictionaries choose sample sentences in order to show how this the specific word is used in the in the sentence. Something I became acutely aware of when I realized that taxation in one of the dictionaries I encountered was used in the example sentence in a way in which one sample sentence of how one used tax and taxation in the sentence criticizes the taxation as a practice and claims that it hinders the development of economy, which I mentioned. You will realize a little bit later why I'm mentioning this. So I assume that many of you, similarly like me, even though I grew up going to libraries, which probably did not look as majestic as Les Chorales, in a way have this unfortunate connection in which libraries are also the spaces of the incredible architectural acumen and in incredible architectural opulence. And this and this kind of brings me to the first moment in which I want to trouble this idea of a library as something that, even though it gives us a lot, is in its origin a kind of a neutral institution which is not framed by its past and which is not framed by the various dynamics and asymmetries out of which it actually raises. So this talk is a lot about importance of kind of reclaiming and working for protecting and expanding the understanding of library as one of the important space for the future of the cities and the communities, the spaces that need to be common, and the spaces that need to be defended because of the austerity measures that in the Western world have been attacking these spaces. I would like to also be cautioned against the idea that we need to save these spaces because they by default have some pristine core that makes them something we need. We need to save public libraries in spite of their problematic origin, and not because there is no problematic origin. So The origin of libraries in the Western Europe, especially, is emerges in the context of monarchical and church power, with a majority of libraries and archives, to that matter, before 19th century being accessible either to the members of the church or aristocracy. And it was one of the initial points of, one of the initial points of contest and contestations of power when the first bourgeoisie started emerging due to the spread of capitalism and colonialism and the advent of printing machine. And one of the ways in which new bourgeoisie as a class started to show their status and compete over who rules the world with the aristocracy was precisely by amassing the large collections of books. So the history of library as a tool of democratization of the access to knowledge is shorter than the history of libraries institution, and in all that spatial splendor, it should really also remind us what is at the back of the origin of the idea of amassing the collections of books. Candida Hofer has a series of photographies of libraries and a book about it, and this is the image from this book. And for me, I have always been really interested in the book in Escorial Royal Spanish Library, which was founded precisely in the moment of Spanish colonial expansion, so between 1563 and 1584 by Philip II. And it's really interesting because not just because of the kind of space, the opulence of space that we see on this photo, but and that it is one of the kind of finest examples of library as a kind of representational power library. But it gets more interesting the more one zooms in. And I unfortunately haven't been able yet in my life to visit this library. I hope it will be, but it's also kind of one of the spaces which is difficult to photo. So the photos I kind of showing are not as great as I would like them to be, but are the ones that I found online. So if you look at zoom into the kind of shelves, it probably is not, I apologize, possible to see, but it is kind of like, but it is that the books are behind the doors, which are with the 13 wire doors. So they are in a shelf and they are, sort of a way caged. So they are, and these kind of doors are usually locked. So it's impossible to actually access them without a lock. But this is not the only interesting part about this library. This becomes even more kind of when we zoom even more. So if you look closely, you can realize that the books are actually not organized in this in the way in which we usually expect books to be organized, so that the spine of the book, where it's written what the book is usually towards the user. Here in this library, they are still organizing them as they were historically when the library was founded, with the spines towards the interior of the bookshelf. This was kind of consciously done as a way of controlling access to what is on the bookshelves, and with this idea that only it's a royal library and only the king actually knows what is the content of the book and which are the books in. So in a way, from this moment of founding of the library, the struggle has always been a bit about, turning the book from this to here, like, about access, which is also not just about access to what is in the book and the physical book, but also about the ways in which the systematization of the knowledge and the systematization of how we approach the book is done. This changes a lot with the French bourgeois revolution, in which, when on 2nd October, French Revolutionary National Parliament passes the resolution of expropriation of all collections of books from clerical and monarchical collections, and starts to make libraries which are accessible to all. I will shortly start to discuss what is this all to which libraries are, who is this all to whom the libraries are accessible at the beginning. So and this is predicated upon the concept of the universal, which is tightly connected to the concept of enlightenment, which which is important to understand that it's not a flat concept, which in the moment of formation includes all humans, but it tries to think, lures us into thinking that it is that universal access to all and all are equal, but we all really well know that the moment of enlightenment and the moment of this human and all humans was created with a specific hierarchy of the people in mind, and this is something, this kind of the promise of equality versus the reality of how this equality was actually taught is something that we are stuck with to this day, and it's a paradox which continues to expose itself in the paradox around which we continue to struggle. I assume that with the unfortunate set of circumstances in which again brought Haiti to the prime time news, we don't necessarily need to immediately start to think who was in this formative moment excluded from the idea of who access to all and universal human. I will from now on focus mostly on the context of the US and the UK onwards. And in the UK, the most important for spreading of the libraries were Chartists and from the public library were the Chartists. And in the US, the most important for the spreading of the public library was philanthropist Andrew Carnegie. This is all happening in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I'm discussing this period of history in which the infrastructure of networks of what public libraries starts to be established. In the UK, Chartists, following their national petition in 1839, established over 700 circulating libraries. And the principle of why circulating library was one of the most important elements of the Chartist intervention into the type of society that the UK it was becoming was written in their point 6 of their charter, which reads as, so quote, to establish circulating libraries from 100 to 200 volumes each, containing the most useful works on politics, morals, the sciences, history, and such instructive and entertaining works as may be generally approved of. Such libraries to vary as much as possible from each other and to be sent in rotation from one town or village in the district to another. They are to be placed in the hands of a responsible person to be lent out according to the rules and after a stated time forwarded to the next district. End of quote. And this is from 1841 edition of Chartism, a new organization of the people by William Lovett and John Collins. So this the idea of the circulating library about as kind of founded by the Chartists was really as with the idea that knowledge should come to those who need it in order to understand their position in the world and in order to educate themselves, and at the beginning it started as a push against the ruling classes in the UK. However, this pushed the UK Parliament to found tax-funded public libraries is 1848, almost as a way or as one of the ways to placate the brewing revolution. I thank Tomislav Medak from Memory of the World for the input on circular libraries and Chartist. So this is something that that was the origin of the public libraries in the UK. What with the US? In the US, Andrew Carnegie made the last grant for a Carnegie Library in 1919. And at that time, there were 3,500 libraries in the US. And and out of these 3,500 libraries, almost half, so 1,689 were built by the Carnegie grant. And a total of 2,500 libraries were built between 1883 and 1929 across the world. Some belonging to the public and some to the university library system. Besides the US, 660 were built in the UK and Ireland, and others in mostly English-speaking countries of the world. But there are actually several in non-English speaking parts of the world, in France, Belgium, and even one in Serbia. So we can say that that in a way, public library, and this again was a push to bring infrastructure and to bring kind of access to knowledge to the people, in which in most of the cases municipalities would apply that wanted to fund a grant, would apply for support from Carnegie, but then the whole process from architecture, who is going to be designing the library, who and how this library is going to be managed would are a lot influenced by the Carnegie Foundation itself. So we can say that in a way, part of this, if one part of the DNA of library is kind of monarchical power, the another part of public libraries is that they are product of class compromise and necessity to educate workers, which does not mean that they did not they did not and do not work as a spaces of emancipation, and does not diminish their capacity to become so. But it's important to understand that this struggle has always been there in understanding. So how universal, so all of these concepts in some ways or another pertain to this idea of the universal access to knowledge. So how universal is actually this universal, and what is the universal? And that's why I am actually thinking through this a little bit with the Carnegie Libraries, because they are useful as they were standardized. Again, this word standardization, because there were several types of standard plans and architecture of the building that were being accommodated in relation to the site where the building would be. So much so that when my friend from the US once visited me in Belgrade, on our passing next to the University Library of the University of Belgrade, which is a Carnegie Library in Belgrade, and I said, oh yeah, this is actually Carnegie Library. There is even a street next to it named Carnegie. And said, oh yeah, of course, look, it looks exactly like every other Carnegie Library. And I was like, aha, okay, great. So they did not necessarily design each one in particular. So for example, if you look at this one, which is a plan of this one, which is a Carnegie Library on 125th Street in New York, we can see that for example, that from the beginning there is an intention to think these libraries as community spaces. Which sometimes gets contested, in which we think that some would like to think that libraries are just storage of books and direct access to book, and not socialization around knowledge and books. Most of Carnegie Libraries have in their plans some form of children's room. Here, this one is on the top floor, and sometimes even this room is not called children's room, but it's called the room for reading stories to children. So there is this aspect of activation and community that is embedded in the space. Yeah, sorry, I just kind of realized that these two slides should have been one after the other. So this might seem a little bit of a detour, but I also really wanted to show you the image of Andrew Carnegie, and to trouble a little bit this idea of philanthropy, especially when we talk. When I'm trying to kind of talk about libraries in the context of commons and space. Mostly because today in this contemporary moment, we are asked, and by say we, I think kind of ordinary citizens of the and those not recognized as citizens of the world are asked to praise super rich for stepping up and filling up the gaps left by the state, or to celebrate the super rich for being able to achieve certain kind of quote unquote progress, as if them becoming a super rich were not a process of regulated deregulation and austerity and the conscious withdrawal of the state from supporting certain activities, especially the spaces of education and access to knowledge through libraries. And this is precisely why the library and access to knowledge became such a hot topic in the West in the last 10, 15 years. So I would like to, I invite you that when you see Carnegie, this image of Carnegie, you actually maybe look at him and see Jeff Bezos, and to be reminded of how abolitionist Ruth Gilmour defines philanthropy as the quote, the private allocation of stolen social wages, end of the quote. And that this idea of that philanthropy can produce spaces which resemble communal luxury is a decoy, but again, it's a decoy with which we have to work. And if we can work with it because in certain aspects, these physical spaces have elements that can be used either in the logic they were thought of, such as the children's room, or and the logic of against their grain. So going back to the kind of provision of spaces in library, which are directly related, there some other libraries, such as, for example, this one is Allegheny City in Pennsylvania from 1890, shows that again that libraries were taught in more complex way than just access and interaction of the books. And this one has a music hall, lecture room, and an art gallery as part of its premises. But it also kind of shows also kind of this what it is, this kind of concept, what is who is accepted as universal in this concept of universal access to all. So, and on this plan, this tiny part, this is the reading room. This tiny part of the reading room is marked as ladies' reading room. So there is, and in some other plans, it is not reading room versus ladies' room, but you kind of have gents' reading room and ladies' reading room. So there is a clear understanding in the name of separation and other. And if we go further, we can look, for example, at this plan of the Carnegie Library from Gainesville, Texas, from 1914. We can see that this is the main door, and that if you look at this other plan of the basement, we can see a back entrance and a reading room for the African American readers, accessible via back entrance, and being this big in size comparing to the main reading room. This serves as a reminder that we cannot ask for spaces produced by philanthropy, and under unquestioned idea of universalism, to correct or to become an obstacle for racialization and other forms of othering, which sit at the core of organization of space in the racial capitalism, and sit at the core and some of the standards in which we think of how libraries can be organized and are organized further. this library here is of course obvious in its segregation, because it was designed for the south of the US during the Jim Crow era, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the libraries in the north were not in different ways imposing this hierarchization of the world. And that's probably the most obvious in the fact that all the Carnegie libraries are really, like most of the Carnegie libraries use some form of neoclassical architectural style, which was a go-to style for this, and this is also the style in which a lot of libraries around Europe and the world and the libraries established by the colonial powers in the colonies are, it took a long time for architecture as a conservative discipline to accept and start discussing openly the tight connection between neoclassicism with the racial racialization and the structuring of the world according to hierarchies. And this is another way in which the libraries, even when they were situated in the communities where there were no open rules against use, were not necessarily with their exterior signaling invitation or acceptance for everyone who were passing by them to come in and use them. This is also important because this approach to understand these moments of understanding of what library is probably the closest to kind of what some of the understanding across the world of the kind of how we understand similar spaces and spaces. But I think here is really important to think this with Dion Brand, who reminds us, and I quote, that just the simple transportation of language, but of ideas of the self and ideas that okay, I'll just rewind. It's really important here to think with Dion Brand and with who reminds us that with language, and here also with the architectural language, this is not just what's happening is not just the simple transportation, but what gets transported with the idea of the language is, I quote, the ideas of the self, and that these ideas of the self contain negations of other people, and that this is embedded in the books that are in the some of the books that are in the library, but also in the objects that contain them, and the bookshelves and the organizing systems. And all these are regulated by code and algorithm, which are not neutral or value-free, but are really embedded and constitutive in a lot in the ways in which they produce political and social relation, and of course also the literary ones, and I can end the paraphrasing of Diane Brandt. So that in that context, learning from Brandt, it is really important to distrust this we in access to all. In same way, we should distrust we in the literary text, and to think this alongside Christina Sharpe, who says, a quote, as one reads, one always encounters that curious quote unquote we, that quote unquote we is constituted with no reference to one's own being, and we made impossible by me. End of quote. So this is something this is something to think about and be reminded of, that this kind of accessible to all does not necessarily reads to everyone accessible to me. It's precisely sometimes because of the language of architecture that certain objects are dressed in, and this is a reminder that in this context that I've kind of showed till now, that these separations, separate entrances are not actually aberration from certain origin of the public library, but that maybe they are constitutive to it, because the public library and its kind of constitution in the French bourgeois revolution is kind of really connected to this idea of the constitution of bourgeois public sphere. So that public library is a public sphere, but the bourgeois concept of public sphere, the one that is theorized by Jürgen Habermas, and to recall in ways in which Nancy Fraser reminds us how this liberal bourgeois concept of public sphere has always been built. In it, always the concept of exclusion of gender, class, and race has always been built in it, because the concept of bracketing the differences never really worked. Habermas celebrates public sphere in which everybody enters by bracketing their differences, and Nancy Fraser criticizes precisely this point, how it's impossible to bracket the differences, but it's important to understand the differences and build on that, which is what Commoning is trying to. So when we go back to the public libraries and Carnegie Public Library, this becomes something that is really interesting. And for this, it's useful to look at the Carnegie Library in 135th Street in New York, which became a center of Harlem Renaissance, and which is now adjacent to the Schomburg Center for the Study of African American Culture. Stavros Stavridis, a Greek architect and theorist of commons, following Dorin Massey, teaches us that, quote, the spaces become socially meaningful in the process of being performed, end of quote. And Ernestine Rose, who became a chief librarian of the New York Public Library branch in this 135th Street in Harlem, understood this really well when she became a head librarian in 1920s. She, as a woman from the white middle class background, whose previous experience was of being a librarian in two branches of New York Public Library and immigrant communities of New York's Lower East Side. She really understood that just the sheer presence of libraries and infrastructure did not necessarily mean that the people in the vicinity for whom this library is intended to be built will necessarily use this as a, so that just this is public does not necessarily mean that people will come and use it. She understood that a lot of neighbors of quote unquote her library came to New York during the North Flight from the Jim Crow South, in which they were not only welcomed in the library, but they were actively banned from using libraries. So she worked on the ways in which one kind of how to make this library accessible, for everyone, for those who are the target audience, and she also understood this. So she wrote that it needs to be constantly repeated that precisely the neighbors around the streets are welcome in the library, that the place is free, and that this continually had to be repeated, and that this also was a way of understanding that in order to do so, she is not doing this as a white missionary trying to say white savior, trying to evangelize people to use the library, but inviting people from the community to with her find ways in which to shape how one uses this library, what is the content of the library, then which are the books, and by going to the place, but not waiting for people to come to the library, but going to the places where a community was gathering and they were was important for the community, and starting from there this conversation. So what she was doing, she was placing ads in the newspapers and going to the churches and church meetings in Harlem, and meeting people and slowly building a group of people that were then invited to join her and start programming and kind of curating the content of this library, which became then the center of Harlem Renaissance, one of these moments of key moments of the production of African American content. And besides that, there was also so beside this type of activating and opening and negotiating in under which ways this building can be used as a library by those who are physically most closest to it. She also understood that there is also other part, that this is not the work that she has to be doing, but that that she needs to open space for emergence of a new first generation of Black librarians, mostly women, who understand much better what is at stake in the access to knowledge and interpretive tools for their own community. And that the type of work that needs to be done is not only about which books one needs to buy for the library, but also how these books are classified in the library, because the universal classification system would often classify the works of African American authors as other and not within the categories in which they were making intervention of. So on the work of there's really a lot of excellent work on the work of Black librarians and the ways they were kind of troubling and changing the standardization system and and the work of libraries. But I would kind of draw attention. I will at the end pop some of the links of the amazing work of Shannon Matter and her article from 2 years ago at the Places journal called The Fugitive Libraries. And part of this was also understanding that when in 1935, a really troubling exhibition opened in the Museum of Modern Art called African Negro Art, for which the curator James Johnson Sweeney collected objects from 72 looted collections from the US and Europe to set up this monumental exhibition. That there was an understanding that this exhibition is to a large extent inaccessible to those who live just 50 streets up north, and to whom these objects would actually be speaking to much more than to those who are coming into the pristine white walls of MoMA to see them in order to reconfirm their subjectivity through this process of looking of African looted objects as the other. And the New York Public Library Harlem branch organized a parallel exhibition of the photography of these objects in order to bring the objects closer to those to the community to whom these objects are speaking more to. Ariella Isho-Zuley lucidly notices that by writing about this example, that the New York Public Library shows explicitly meant meant for the 135th Street branch of a Harlem community offered African Americans the chance to interact with their ancestor objects through the photographs, and how this was telling on two levels. First, that it was really not that this was really important on two levels. Not the first one being, okay, we are making this accessible for free for those who cannot afford to pay, but also that this was offering for the possibility for the descendants of communities with which these objects were appropriated to that these artists could benefit from a more privileged access, so that okay, sorry, I just kind of got a little bit confused with my notes. So Ariella shows like kind of connects, so that there is a moment in which, okay, there is like the photographs to a certain level allowed access and made a corrective towards who has the access to this exhibition and who has the access to establish these connections to the elements, to these looted ancestral objects. But on the other hand, these were still photographs and photographs. So the real access to the objects was actually never really possibly established. So that on one side, the foundation who organized this exhibition mediates one level of accessibility, but on another level, it still kind of prevents bringing back both these objects into the real life and not just leaving them as bare documents. What I think here is interesting is not only this dichotomy of who, but that this in which, if we think of New York MoMA as one of the sites in which certain type of subjectivity is produced, that it speaks to that idea of the Enlightenment. The New York Public Library branch, where these photographs appear, starts to work as some kind of the undercommons of that Enlightenment process, and it starts to work to show this malleability of public library to be both a space in which certain aspects of Enlightenment get celebrated, but also allows the contestation of that Enlightenment to happen, and that the public library has this kind of elasticity and plasticity in which these processes can happen, and this kind of confrontation can happen at certain moments. And that library really and truly can be understood as infrastructure and not just as a space of books, which the concept of library of infrastructure was, of course, written the best by Shannon Mattern in her text about library as infrastructure that is also on places, and in this case, then what becomes really important is this understanding a library as one of the fundamental urban spaces in the city. And Stavros Stavridis reminds us, I quote, that urban space is revealed to have the crucially important role that differs from most of the goods and services distributed in the cities. Urban commoning neither simply happens in the urban space, nor does it simply produce urban space as a commodity to be distributed. So in order for commoning to have to take place and to happen, urban space needs, physical space needs to exist. And that's why I have been kind of insisting a lot on this kind of concept of space, of kind of that one needs to think issues of library through this space, understanding of it as a space, but also understanding how this space is really not innocent in understanding access to all and access to struggle. Which brings us to contemporary moment, and I realize I'm kind of cautious of time that I've been kind of dragging a little bit longer than I should by now, so I will skip a little bit of what I plan to talk so that we can have some time for questions as well. So there are two kind of, so I'm kind of trying now to jump from this moment that I've been discussing into this kind of a little bit more contemporary situation in which the 90s and especially early 2000s and the advent of and the kind of the growing presence of internet and digital communication in the world really brought the promise of the kind of the internet being this site of where all knowledge can be accessed, and which in a way disturbed the centrality of library for certain communities in certain cities as the place one goes to access the knowledge, and how this narrative of skipping from physical into digital space to a certain extent left libraries open to the attack of entrepreneurialism, in which libraries got asked to much more start to open up hubs and incubators in their physical spaces, and also forgetting how for many people libraries are still important, not only because they access internet from there, but also they are the spaces in which they can come together. In this context of the tension between online and offline and the libraries, and two different type of new engagement of the spaces that is outside of the institutional forms of libraries and kind of pertains to this idea of the library emerged. And one is in the phenomenon of little free libraries, which kind of are the neoliberalization into the full of the concept of the library. And I'm not going to, and they are not libraries at all, but started popping up almost as a foreshadow of the gentrification in the certain cities, as the symbol for certain people of the people sharing and people coming together and coming. I think that this is something that needs to be really understood what it is, and that I don't want to spend more time on it, but I want to point you to the seminal article by James Schmidt and Jordan Hale called Little Free Libraries, Trademarked, interrogating the space of the branded books exchange, to understand to which ways these kind of little free libraries really are something that is more troubling than solving a lot of problems. But what are shadow libraries in this context? So when I talk about shadow libraries, I talk about the specific group of online repositories of books and scientific articles, which are usually created by several individuals and by projects, is a kind of a project in which allow people to access, and in some cases also share and upload various forms of content of kind of books or articles that are usually stored in certain libraries. You probably use and know many of these. Some of these are Library Genesis as the largest one, Memory of the World of Public Library, ARG, UboWeb or Monoscope are the most kind of famous examples under this concept of shadow library. So why are shadow libraries not what free libraries are? They do also in a way come from some kind of a private initiative or like initiative of the person of this kind of specific group of people. But I would like to argue that what crucially differentiates them is the awareness of into what they are intervening into, and that they are precisely intervening into the asymmetry of the access and asymmetry of this understanding of what is access to all. And this is probably articulated the best in the work of Alexandra Elbakian, the person behind Sci-Hub, when we think about the intervention in the field of academic publishing, where she, as a PhD student in Kazakhstan, realized that she can't afford the access, that none of the institutions she's studying affiliated with cannot afford the access to the online repositories of academic knowledge, even though a lot of this academic knowledge is produced by public money, and used her knowledge in coding in order to kind of code the Sci-Hub as a site through which people access academic, kind of liberate the academic narrative. Or on the other hand, ARG and Memory of the World, public library, which are also intervening in the question of concept of access to the knowledge and who has the access to knowledge, by kind of also understanding the importance of socializing the knowledge, and with that also socializing the struggle. So unlike little free libraries. What shadow libraries really come from understanding of lack and become a fight, a struggle, a point of struggle and a fight. So in a way, they are operating within the concept of really useful knowledge and the struggle that I was bringing about at the beginning. And there is on another side and there is a kind of another examples that I'm again indebted to Shannon Matter, who defines fugitive libraries in her text on fugitive libraries. She builds on the work of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney and defines fugitive libraries, as I quote, an undercommons, a place allowing for an ongoing experiment with informal ways of learning together, building futures together. And she, end of quotes. And she stresses also that, quote, that the fugitive libraries are necessarily spatial. Because a fugitive library cannot easily ignore logistics or a position, and that ultimately all those books take up a lot of space. End of quote. Here's a good moment also to just kind of pause briefly and say that I could not be doing this talk without thinking with the work of Shannon Matter for years now, and that for many things she taught me about libraries, another thing that she taught me was the importance of having a little bit of humor in writing about any topic, but especially when it comes to issues around how do we learn and how do we study together. So she comes up with this articulation of the concept of fugitive library by looking at the several current practices and many of which have been inspired by the work of Black Quantum Futurism Collective and their project of the Community Futures Lab, such as Free Black Women's Library, the Eternal Summer of the Black Feminist Mind project, or the work of Chimurenga, Reading Zimbabwe, or the Book Bank in Nairobi. So all these initiatives which try to intervene into the access of people to the access of the specific, in most of the cases, in the US cases, African American, more working class and more oppressed populations, or in the context of Chimurenga and who work from South Africa, or Reading Zimbabwe and Buknog who work in Nairobi, of the projects that intervene in the contexts where there is a lack of physical infrastructure and collections of the books and other type of content that is produced by the communities for the communities, and through which people can access the knowledge that helps them interpret their own position in the world and in the society. In this context, the Free Black Women's Library is probably the most easy one to explain. This is because it is a kind of a collection of books written by the Black women in various genres, which are by the initiator of the Free Black Women's Library, physical collection of books which are staged in various spaces around the cities, starting from the New York, on the stoop, and growing into various kind of community spaces and stuff. So it's, and again, this idea of the library coming to people, book coming to people who need them in order to interpret their position in the world. So shadow libraries and fugitive libraries is something that both operate on the edges of the both digital edges and physical spatial edges of the public library as the institution, and challenge challenge and make physical libraries think through to which extent they are really kind of accessible to all, to whom they are accessible, and in which ways, and they offer interpretive tools to those who come and frequent them in order to kind of understand their position in society and change it. And I would just like to kind of try to wrap up with then some kind of a proposal or kind of further propositions for thinking how we can think further if we think about what public library can become from this really scattered and not at all unified rush through history and contemporary examples that I've tried to enact here. So evoking Aimé Césaire, who adapted Shakespeare play The Tempest into A Tempest, adaptation for a Black theater, I propose that we kind of maybe try to think to shift from the public library to a public library, to kind of a new institutional imaginaries, and to build this on the idea of commons, which is always about responsibilities and rights, care and maintenance, and as a relation to the others and not just towards the self, but also on the idea of commons as articulated and conceptualized by Peter Linebaugh, for whom the commoning is always about taking power, and revoking again Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, who says that those who define our own power, and to think this through together further with kind of feminism, because I see feminism and commons in the similar way, because both are about, as feminist and awesome theorist Olala Olufemi says, wonderfully puts his projects about what could be. They are both nouns that actually act as verbs. And so when I say feminism, I think and I hear intersectional feminism, I hear abolition, I hear Black feminism, I hear feminism formed from below, from the struggle of those who are the most oppressed and most invested in radical transformation of what the world could be. So same this can be said of commons, and both the concepts are formed in struggle against enclosures and extractions, enclosures of space, bodies, and time. And they are both enacted in practice before they were named and articulated. And understanding that each naming and articulation is important because it is a moment of crystallization, but it's also a moment with which comes the danger of closure of a certain possibility. So, and these both concepts allow us to think and act. So what I'm going to do now is kind of throw at you three different principles, which I think are important, that draw on all this. That I think are important as a way to think with the future of a library and access to knowledge. The first principle draws directly on the practices of intervention of feminists in the free software circles around the idea of the codes of conduct, and understanding that and of importance of potential expansions of the practice of constituting community through collectively writing and articulating codes of conduct from digital to physical space, which also already exists in many physical spaces as well. But to really think about this, not just in the context of self-formed group, but what would it mean to transform already existing libraries by asking those who use them to define codes of conduct, in which codes of conduct are not necessarily just connected to the idea of creating safe spaces from various types of harm human beings can enact to each other, but also which comes to the kind of defining the ways in which books, which working hours, and under which conditions this physical space of the libraries can be used, which include both those who work and those who are the patrons of the library. The second principle of the right to opacity, which of course is a concept that Edward Glissant gifted to the world when he argues in Parts of Poetics of Relation for the right to opacity as a way to avoid the pitfall of accepting a difference. It's as a kind of a way to kind of challenge this perspective of the Western thought to understand that that demand for transparency does not necessarily lead to a more equal society, and this demand for transparency in order to understand and accept accept the others, but accepting differences that disrupt hierarchies. So, and as quoting Dilsan, who says the right to opacity that is not enclosure within the impenetrable autarky with the substance within the irreducible singularity. Opacities can coexist and converge within fabric. To understand this truly, one must focus on the texture of the weave and not on the nature of its component, which I think is really something that pertains in the first round probably mostly to the problem of classification of knowledge, on which the library is a temple of, but then all the other different ways in which the form make knowledge unattainable, invisible, but also the ways in which one can organize whom and what type of content has the space in library. And the third kind of principle, which is which are two similar, which are kind of two things, but also for me, they cannot be one without the other. And that's the question of activation and consciousness rising. I borrowed the concept of activation from the Mayday rooms, a living archive and a physical space that exists in London, which describes activation with the following words. Mayday Rooms is dedicated to the collective activation of historical material through a variety of small-scale forums and research projects developed around its collection. Mayday Rooms aims to create dynamic situations, not to sit passively on archival holdings. By using the intrinsic socializing potential of historical material, we hope to allow the latencies of the past and the future to meet in an open field beyond the enclosures of official knowledge. What happens in that field cannot be predicted. It is up to those who gather around the material to set it resonating. While Mayday Rooms is defining this principle precisely in connection to their specific archival holdings, I think that this is something that can be taught much broader than archives, but also to kind of any kind of form of knowledge that can bring people together that needs to be activated in order to start to resonate. And that this is tightly connected to concept of consciousness raising, which is something that I learned from Bell Hooks, who in the Feminism for Everybody says feminists are made, not born. One does not become an advocate for feminist politics simply by having the privilege of having been born female. Like all political positions, one becomes a believer in feminist politics through choice and action. And that this process of consciousness raising is really something that is tightly connected to the socialization of interpretive tools to understand one's position in the society, which is tightly connected to both access to physical space where people can meet and to the access to knowledge that allows this process to happen. Ruth Wilson Gilmour simply says that it's not just experience, it is consciousness and consciousization that gives birth to the abolitionist thinking and presence. And this is why I think that these are something that one really needs to kind of think through and kind of insist on libraries as important sites for the kind of future of commoning and future of society. And one of the ways to do this, I have been recently thinking with my friend and collaborator Rebecca Kiesewetter about reading group and the potential of reading group as something that is also so tightly connected to the question of library and books. And we thought of think of reading group as a specific relational form of production of knowledge that can appear as a prescriptive and normative space, as prescriptive and normative space is dominated by social protocols and behavioral norms that impose racial, gender, class, and ability orders and prevent equitable exchange. Yet the reading groups, conjoining diverse and potentially conflicting positionalities, perspectives, capabilities, narratives, and knowledges, as well as multiple places, layers, scales, and rhythms of engagement, can also offer space for vulnerability and intimacy. And this is precisely the type of encounter that libraries can foster. And I would like to finish here. Thank you. Maybe I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dubravka. I'm on the run.
Yeah, apologies. I tried to keep it shorter.
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you before Sophie or Simone chip in to do the questions. I just wanted to say that there were so many concepts to think. And one thing I was just writing to start with the question that I was just writing on the chat now was the library also as a threat. Which is also very interesting, and you approach it from different levels. Also the manuscripts, but also the kind of content, I mean the manuscripts and the content, but also the building. And I'm referring specifically in the 2013, burn of the Timbuktu manuscripts in Mali, and the library, and also the very known Nazi burning of books in the many different squares, Castle Square included. So I wanted to hear a few comments from this and then leave to other questions. And good night from me.
Yeah, okay. So I first also realized I really need to apologize. I'm still suffering from a post-PhD period in which I'm incapable of really distilling all my kind of ideas. And I know that I have packed here much more than I should have to make this a little bit more accessible. Thank you for this excellent question. On one level, I think that the burning of Nazi burning of the books, or the books of is really precisely the type of kind of act which really reminds us of the importance of the libraries, and they are not, and the question around their neutrality or non-neutrality. One of the first things that happened, for example, in Croatia after the falling apart of Yugoslavia was erasure of a lot of books from the libraries, both their physical removal from the stocks, but also erasure from the various classification systems, and of the specific content of the books that were kind of vanished were books which are theorizing socialist self-management as the kind of Yugoslav practice of establishing a different type of society, which is not built on capitalist ideas, but is not built on the state socialism that as the Soviet Union model. But also the books which were related to all the different ways of kind of solidarity across nations and across ethnicities, and the discourse and the books which are related to anti-fascistic struggle. So this kind of points to this importance of not trusting libraries completely as well, that they hold, and to always look at what is missing and what is not included in libraries, and that is why precisely various projects of kind of shadow libraries, but also even before that of kind of alternative collections, alternative archives, and alternative libraries are really important, because they are always showing this kind of a struggle of what is considered worthy of being included into certain catalogs in certain places, and what is considered what is not considered worthy. And that this is also again another process of defining what is proper and useful and what is not. I kind of have a small role as a shadow librarian in one of the libraries that I mentioned, amateur librarians. And one of the ways in which, for example, for me personally, I became a little bit radicalized when it comes to this topic was incredible annoyance about visiting. And when okay, there are two elements of this. One was growing up in in Serbia in the 90s and studying in early 2000 without architecture, without accessing some of the any kind of books that I was interested in, but also such as books that are related to architecture and feminism, but also the books that were kind of just the most successful, most basic books around these topics, such as SML Excel of Rem Koolhaas, which Architectural Library in Belgrade bought more than 10 years after it was published. And so I was really annoyed when I realized that in the library of a really big and important and rich architectural school in Central Europe, the open stacks of Architectural Library has like whole shelf of books by Le Corbusier, but that all the books about architectural feminism or Grand Domestic Revolution of Dolores Haydn and all these that are kind of point to a different approach to space are in the closed text, which okay, they are accessible, but the open stacks allow for this chance encounter. You can in library you can have a chance encounter with people, but you can also have chance encounter with books, which is something that is really important, which is not doesn't happen if you have to search and order a book from stack. So one of the things that I started doing is to partly from annoyance to that, but also partly to kind of thinking about maybe some other Dubravkas that were 18 and starting architecture or thinking about space and what is their space in the world. I started digitizing all these books and then using the shadow libraries in order to make them accessible. With that, and because I was affiliated to that institution for a while, I also kind of could pester people who organize the library and ask them to maybe think about which books are accessible in the OpenStack or not. So I think that this is really a complex question, and about in which ways we can kind of burning of books and kind of attacks on libraries of that type either can be understood. This kind of opens a really different ways of entering into the similar type of questions about what is contained in the libraries, who has the access, how this is organized, and in which ways this is protected, and what is deemed dangerous.
Okay, yeah, Dubravka, thank you. This is Sophie now, because Marina has,
yes.
I think she just listened on the run, so to speak. Thank you so much for the inspiring lecture. And I don't see any other questions in the chat, but we've been fairly around for an hour and a half, so I'm not sure if there is any other comments, so you maybe just want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly, as we also now only a few people left. If not, I suggest it's a lot to digest.
Yes, I again, yes, but okay, what we can do is that I can type my email address in the.
Yeah, please, that would be wonderful. Yes.
Can I sorry, it's one question of the off.
So please, okay, I see that Cesar is also, so I can see there are at least 2 questions, so.
Okay. So I don't see questions, but maybe you just raised the hand, which I don't see at the moment, but maybe you just want to unmute and ask.
Well, I first also heard Philene who unmuted first. Yeah, so please.
First, well, sorry, I was a little bit late in joining, but anyhow, what I heard was very fascinating. And I'm an archivist, and that's how we met in Zurich years ago when I was working there at the archive. And of course, when someone talks about libraries, I often think about archives as well. And I wanted to know how you see the relation between archives and libraries, if you thought about that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you for this question. Also, hi, Philene. I think this is also really something that is that is really important question. I think that this which I think that sometimes we think that the difference between archive and libraries is about exclusivity of the holding, in a sense that archives are always trying to get what the one copy of something, one plan or something, which then puts the pressure of these documents on and the kind of that they hold history in a specific way, and then kind of library, especially public library, operate in this idea that that there are many of the copies of that, which seems that they should not be taught together, but I think that they need to be taught together, especially if we think about this kind of a position of both of these as a kind of accumulation of knowledge, and we think of this as something as the processes from below and not necessarily top down and directed from the kind of idea of kind of archives or libraries as something that is kind of constituted through the nation state or something. And I think that media rooms for me has been really something that I've been thinking a lot about it, because their archival holdings has a lot of materials which are somehow always in between, because a lot of their archival holdings, because they are the institution which is consciously founded as a way to be they call themselves living archive of the urban of the movement, of the social movements. There is a lot of in their kind of holdings in their archive are also a lot either kind of self-published books or zines or books which were kind of published by independent, self-organized, of not necessarily all of which exist in the big libraries and the collections, but which are also on a lot of bookshelves of people. So I think in this struggle of who controls the access and how this, especially how the knowledge is organized, and how these kind of holdings are organized, I think there is a lot of thinking together to be done between the archives and the libraries, and to think then in which ways it's possible to open up access to certain things. I hope this especially I think when it comes to the question around production of knowledge from below, whatever this means, because I realize when I say something so charged, we can spend the next couple of hours at least, or if not years, discussing what that it can be and is.
Great, thanks.
Okay, I now see Cesar, who is hi Cesar, thank you for switching on the video as well.
Hello, Dubravka, thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers of this wonderful thing. We are companions in this task of custodians. In fact, I have to say thank you for all the inspiration that your work has mean for DPR Barcelona. So thank you very much. And now for structuring this knowledge in this lecture, I have one point that I want to know your opinion. You were mentioning about this feminist approach, this transactional, in some way inspirational, but also activator of this new concept of library. And I was wondering how other knowledges should be included or discussed or even shared under this approach. I'm talking about oral tradition, songs, dance, which are not books in themselves, but are maybe fundamental in understanding other views of the world that may not be attached to that Western academic understanding of what is knowledge. I'm really willing to know how you can see that possible. If it is.
Yeah, well, I think there was a moment in which I was kind of in the talk when I was showing the kind of the photographies at the exhibited object, the photograph of exhibited objects in MoMA and the photograph of objects, which I can imagine maybe was the moment when this question kind of crystallized, in which I was like, okay, I can't go on this detour, because that would mean, because I'm aware that so I think that this is really something that is really important to address. What is considered kind of container of knowledge that we recognize as a container of knowledge, and what is considered as not, that it's not, or the hierarchy that is embedded in that, which is precisely something that I kind of try to think with this kind of this unsettling and the stabilizing of this idea of the universal that I kind of think with many people, but I think that Sylvia Winter definitely is the crucial. So this opens up, I think, various ways in which this is something that is a project from below, meaning that it's not, there is no one recipe how this can unfold, because there are many ways in which people understand knowledge differently in their own kind of communities and stuff. And then and what would then be this, so I think that this is also the ways in which libraries can become more than they are, but we can still keep on using the word library, even though it's so tightly connected to the book in its kind of origin. And I think that Philene's question already points a little bit in that direction, in the sense of, what to do, what to do with certain ephemera. Would the parasite reading groups that you're organizing, and the kind of pamphlets that you are publishing for each of these sessions, which are fragments from various texts that you think are important to bring into certain conversation, and then have this socialized moment of activating this, that you come as a selection, and using this as interpretive tools to understand the world and create certain imaginary. Would you put them in an archive, or you put them in a library? But and then in which ways encountering the library would give all this context, or what can this produce? Of course, we cannot control, which books spark which imaginaries. But I think that digital helps here. I think the kind of digitization and digital helps here. The practice of in rich Western countries, in which one actually kind of, especially city libraries, do have collections of CDs and films that one can come and rent, also kind of point to this, that of course in conversations as this, it's really important to understand that this is also one specific understanding of the ways in which knowledge is kind of captured and contained. So I think again, I mean, without again kind of having this conversation, or so I think so type of unlearning of libraries is really important, to kind of use the concept of unlearning that Ariela Azoulay really wonderfully kind of articulates and gives us to think with.
Okay, thank you very much, dear custodian.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining here.
Are you still there, Dubravka?
I'm here. Yeah, I'm here. I'm kind of
sorry, I just lost the image.
If I was just kind of seemed as if I was only, I was just kind of paying attention to a still screaming dog, unfortunately.
So I guess maybe we call it a day for today. Thank you so much for your inspiring lecture. For those who also kind of want to recap a few moments of the lecture, we will put it online.
Yes, and also just whoever wanted something to kind of interact, or I promised links which I didn't pass, but if you want on them or anything, just please email me and I will be happy to answer the questions, share your criticism, and I will share the links and any materials that I was mentioning.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to just add or announce our next event, because in a way the struggle continues. So on Monday, which is the 23rd of August, we will have a lecture by Eva Majewski about the kind of anti-fascist feminist struggles in Poland these days. So please feel free to join us on Zoom again. And Other than that, thank you very much for joining tonight, and yeah, have a good evening. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you and goodbye.